Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first official episode of Season 3 of the Historians Lounge. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we are going to be talking about a topic that is very, very fascinating to the both of us. Now, my guest today is making a return to the show. Maybe you remember him in his first historians interview, but as a refresher, my guest today was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and holds a graduate degree in world history from Norwich University in Vermont and teaches history at Joliet Junior College. His areas of interest include Greek religion, classical Greek and Roman warfare, Philip II Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic world, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire. Its graduate school capstone focused on using military intelligence in Julius Caesar's army during the Gallic War. Ancient military intelligence has often been overlooked, and he hopes to contribute to this topic extensively. He's committed to furthering his knowledge of history and staying on the forefront with the latest scholarship in ancient history. He is a member of the Associate of Ancient Historians, the Society for Classical Studies, and the Society for the Study of the Crusades and the Latin East. And when not researching history, he's very active. He loves spending time with his friends and family, running, swimming, golfing, lifting weights, and traveling. And among his travels in Europe, he has been to Rome and Greece, exploring many ancient sites and doing research. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this introduction, viewers and listeners, my guest and I will be talking about a topic that we are both fascinated in, and that is, of course, Alexander the Great. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our returning guest, Professor Phil Mathew. Professor Mathew, thank you so much for coming on the show again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we dive into today's topic, would you like to tell everybody what you've been up to since the last time you were on the show?
Oh, haven't been through a whole lot. I was recently a historical consultant for an exhibit on Roman gladiators in the UK, and yeah, they needed somebody to talk more about um, injury and some and about medical procedures on on gladiators and gladiators who have disabilities mainly. The thing was that was a topic where not a whole lot was done, but I told them, what is out there. You got to read Cassius Dio. You read about, he's our main primary source with that,
Mm-hmm.
and it turned out that one of the main topics was Commodus and about how he
Mm-hmm.
dealt with a gladiator that had a disability. It is a topic where so much still needs to be done. It is one of those things in the ancient world where more research needs to be done. So I helped them out with that. And and additionally, there hasn't been a whole lot going on. Just teaching, just I had a lot on my plate with that, and yeah, that book I mentioned before was still in progress. So there is still some work to be done with that, but it will come out as at some point. It will.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have you back on the show, Professor Matthews, because today's topic, viewers and listeners, is about probably one of the most famous individuals of the classical age as well as the Hellenistic age, Alexander the Great. And I know there's been a lot of discussions on Alexander the Great, from his military background, his leadership skills, his use of tactics in the ancient world. But there's one topic that really hasn't been discussed as of late, which is, of course, was Alexander a good guy or a bad guy? Now, I turn over to you, Professor Matthews. What about this topic is, very fascinating to you as a fellow classical historian?
What I find interesting about this topic is the fact that there is evidence on to support both sides. Because on one hand, people call him a genius, a liberator, and a heroic king. On the other hand, people call him a tyrant and a conqueror. And then there are those historians who take the middle ground And that's what I personally do. I personally do take the middle ground, saying he was a man who had both good and bad qualities. There's no, just saying leaning towards one side or the other is just portraying half the picture. The thing is, there's been a lot of studies done on Alexander's personality. There's been a lot of topics done on, sorry, a lot of research done on his on what to label him. And when you look through that, you find his personality. It's a very complex one, and there's evidence that supports both sides.
Definitely. And I definitely think it's important to look at, Alexander's childhood when examining this very complex individual. And from my limited, research and understanding of Alexander, he was kind of like a pawn in the Macedonian power play. His mother, trained him to take over his father, Philip II. And there's evidence that, that they worked together, they conspired to murder his father. And there are some sources that say otherwise. So it's really interesting to look at, this very complex figure. But I also think we have to understand is that, from the sources that you've looked into, Professor Matthews, what would constitute as a good king in the Hellenistic perspective, as well as a tyrant of the Hellenistic age? Because both those words are very different depending on the context in which you view them.
Yeah, the on one hand, calling him, a more benevolent king, that kind of thing. We they do talk very little bit about that towards the Macedonian people because, when he ascends to power as king, we don't hear a whole lot about his time as just king in Macedonia, because then shortly after ascending the throne, he does maintain order in Europe, but then he goes immediately on campaign to conquer the Persian Empire.
Yes.
But during his time as his time campaigning, there are a number of cities one by one that were viewing him as a great liberator. And what I found interesting the most was his time in Egypt
Mm.
when he and this also kind of ties into when he goes to Babylon. The thing is, if you may recall, Cyrus the Great was the Persian king who was best known for his policy of religious tolerance. He
Yes.
believed he believed that if you let the people of your empire retain the religion of their forefathers, they will respect you. If you don't do that, they won't. So Cyrus the Great's successors did not carry that out. Many and that's what led to a number of them having to deal with revolts in Egypt. Like when
Mm.
you read the Greco-Persian Wars, there's talk about Darius during the Battle of Marathon and even Xerxes when he's fighting at Thermopylae. They also have to deal with a revolt in Egypt. The Egyptians hated the Persians because they did not let them retain their own religion. And when Alexander comes in 332 BC, the Egyptians welcome him as a liberator, and he gave them back their religion. There is, according to the primary source, he did travel down to Memphis and he sacrificed to the Apis bull. And he, in giving them back their religion, they honored him. They praised him as a liberator, and then he's later crowned as their pharaoh. He is the first Macedonian pharaoh of Egypt. And so when he went to Babylon after conquering the much of the Persian Empire, defeating Darius at Gaugamela, in his march into Babylon, he orders the Babylonians to restore the temple of Marduk, which Xerxes had ordered demolished. And there is also an account about him going into the second temple of Jehovah when he goes into Jerusalem. But that account, written by Josephus, historians have dismissed that as fiction. So
Mm.
there's no doubt about it that he probably did the same thing for the Jews. But like I said, our account of that meeting, historians have dismissed it as fiction. Yeah, because Josephus, is another topic altogether about whether he's a reliable source or not. And the other thing is, so a lot of peoples in his empire were also exposed then to Greek culture and the Greek language. A lot, even the Jews, the Egyptians, and even people in far off India, they learned how to speak and write in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some people who look back at that and say that his spread of Greek culture is was a very enlightening thing. Like in that sense, you can call him Prometheus. He's giving this sense of enlightenment to these other people, just as Prometheus gave fire to mankind and they grew as a civilization. They're saying the same thing with Alexander when he spread Greek culture and thought. Because remember, the Greeks thought that their culture, their civilization, everything about them, they're the best,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is the most enlightening. So these are some ways in which you could regard him as a good king. A lot of the other things they say positively about him was about how great of a general he was.
Right. That is actually very, very true. And I'm glad you brought that up, like kind of like separating the two, him as the good king as opposed to him being the general. Because a lot of us, especially in the non-academic world, we only know him as just the general, the famous general that was the inspiration for Julius Caesar. He wanted to be the next Julius Caesar. And it is fascinating, looking at Alexander's record for however long he lived, which was a very, very short time. He accomplished a lot. I mean, you're absolutely right. He brought the Greek culture to the rest of the world at that time. I mean, it laid the foundation for, of course, one of his generals to establish the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, which was a blend of the two. You also have the Antioch faction, which took over much of Greece and Anatolia, otherwise known as Turkey. You also have the Sassanids, which is probably one of the largest Greco kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's reign, and that was also a blend of the various cultures that were living in the former regions of the Persian Empire. And of course, India, which I don't think gets a lot of scholarship during this classical period when looking at the Hellenistic age, because it is absolutely true. You had the Bactrians, which were a mix of like the Greco-Indus culture. There was a mix of like the coins, war elephants, language, warfare. And that's even recorded during the War of the Heavenly Horses with the
Yes.
Chinese who fought the Bactrians, who fought like their Greek forefathers. So it's all very, very fascinating. So that then leads to a discussion. Why is there almost a topic of like him being, viewed as a tyrant in the sense that when we think of tyrants, we think of like, wicked men or cruel rulers. But is there scholarship to really back this up?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on, how you read the primary sources, how you interpret his actions. I mean, you look at it, there were times where Alexander, we do see his dark side throughout his story.
Mm-hmm.
Like especially when he ascends to power following Philip's murder. The There's been a lot of discussion and debate about who was truly behind Philip's murder. I mean, yes, Pausanias, the page, carried out the act, but the question is who was pulling his strings. You know, there are scholars like Robin Lane Fox and others who question, like, was Alexander truly involved? Olympia certainly had motive because she was a woman scorned. But it's only a probability. We don't know for sure. And
Mm.
then the thing is, whether Alexander was involved or not, that's been up for debate because Robin Lane Fox thinks Alexander could not have been involved, and it's something we're never really going to know for sure. But what is true is after Philip's murder and then Alexander ascends to the throne, he and Olympias immediately purge the royal Argead house of any potential rivals to Alexander, including Alexander's cousin Amyntas III. And then Olympius orders the execution of Attalus, the Macedonian noble his niece, Eurydice, also known as Cleopatra II, married Philip. She was his one and only Macedonian wife and eighth wife, and they had a child together. Olympius orders the execution of Attalus, and then Alexander carries out the execution of the rest. Like they said, the young boy who named Carinus, that was Philip's last child, the only Macedonian heir. He made sure that the baby boy was eliminated.
Yeah, that's rough.
And then after that, there's a number of episodes that portray his potential dark side. Like when he is campaigning in the Balkans, there was word that Alexander died at the siege of Pelium, and this caused the Thebans to revolt. And then he goes down to the city-state of Thebes, and at the end of the Theban revolt, much of the city was destroyed with the exception of the house of the Greek poet Pindar. And he spared Pindar's family. And then a lot of the population that was either killed or enslaved. This has gone down as one of the episodes that portrays Alexander's dark side. You know, because they're saying he was cruel to the Thebans this way. Now, throughout much of the first half of the whole Persian campaign, there is talks about him being a bit of a liberator, and they also show like some good relations between him and his troops. Like he gets to know his soldiers by name. He rewards them for their bravery on the battlefield. Yeah, and I always found that interesting when studying military history is the relationship between a Greek or Roman general and his soldiers. You know, this was the case with Julius Caesar in Gaul. This was the case with the Roman Emperor Caracalla when he campaigned in Germania. Like they form a close bond with their soldiers. But then after Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire and he ascends to power, there's a number of episodes where there's friction between him and his troops. And this does bring to surface his dark side. You know, before I get into that, I also wanted to mention another episode that does portray his dark side that a lot of historians talk about was his siege of Tyre. That is my personal favorite of his major battles because of what he did there was ambitious, just trying to get over to the island. But the thing is, of course, after he breaches the walls of the city, he shows no mercy to the inhabitants. There's like 6,000 or so men crucified. There's a lot of people sold into slavery and such. And then he pays tribute to Melkart, the Phoenician deity associated with Heracles. And yeah, so and then the same thing happened with Gaza. Like when he lays siege to Gaza, King Baitus, the Arab king of Gaza, was killed and then tied to a chariot, and then his body's dragged around. That is a parallel to when Achilles killed Hector.
Yes.
And they thought this is Alexander believing he was Achilles and trying to glorify himself. And yeah, a lot of the episodes where there's friction between him and his troops, this is what really does bring out his dark side. Like some of the things are like there was supposedly an assassination attempt against his life. And they're saying that Philotas, the son of Parmenion, did not report this. And in addition, he also whispered thoughts about ambition, probably seizing power for himself to like a mistress named Antigone. And then she supposedly reported this to Alexander, and Alexander was disappointed that Philotas didn't report the assassination, didn't report. So he had Philotas tortured, then he ultimately had him killed. And then he took that anger out on Philotas's father, Parmenion. Parmenion was a loyal general to Philip and Alexander. He was a senior officer great general. The thing is, Alexander thought Parmenion was now a liability, and that when you take out take your anger out about an assassination attempt or a potential crime on one person, this is them taking it out on the whole family.
Mm.
And even to ensure that there's no one's really going to avenge his death and such. The other thing is you may recall the drunken quarrel with his officer Clitus the Black.
Yes.
This is one where we do see Alexander's dark side. The thing is, in that episode, yeah, Clitus is to be made the satrap or provincial governor of Bactria, and then during that festival, he is a bit drunk and such, and he's speaking words of treason against Alexander, telling Alexander that, yeah, he thinks that living in Bactria like this is exile. He doesn't want to associate with these natives. He thinks Alexander is abandoning him on the far edges of his empire. And then he speaks words of treason against Alexander and even compares him to his father Philip. Now, while this is happening, Alexander is drunk too. And then this leads to a bit of anger on both sides. And then a number of the officers try and get Clitus out of there because they're afraid, yes, somebody is going to murder somebody. So they had to put a stop to this. And then Clitus does come back into the room, and then Alexander does kill him with a spear. Immediately, he comes back to his senses and couldn't believe that this man who saved his life at the Granicus River, whose own sister, Lanique, nursed him as a baby, that he just killed him. And he's like, I just killed her brother. And he falls into despair for days. And then, of course, there are some Eastern priests who told him, is this Alexander who cries because he killed a man? And they asked him, how can you live in fear of the law when you yourself are the law? And whatever is done by supreme power is technically considered right. And then that eventually justified this. But historians look back at this and realize, yeah, you can't really justify killing, especially like in this sense, and these are some episodes where we do see friction between him and his troops.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, we just see the worst come out of him. And some of that does have to do with, especially in the case with Clitus, with the fact that a lot of his troops didn't like the fact that he was adopting Eastern ways and Eastern customs, like putting on a Median robe, and then the whole policy of proskynesis where they had to kiss him like by his hand. And they thought that's only reserved for gods. And they don't think he was a god. And, so these are some episodes that really do spark friction between him and his troops. And furthermore, there are the mutinies in later on. The Hyphasis mutiny, his men didn't want to go further with him into India, and then he had no choice but to listen to them. And then the Opus mutiny later on was also an ugly confrontation. And then he had the ringleaders killed because he was going to give an honorable discharge to all his Greek and Macedonian troops. And he was going to go campaign further on with his Asiatic troops, and they thought that he's abandoning them. Because remember, one of the things with the Greek Macedonian mindset is they think they are the cornerstone of civilization, that they are the best, and that Alexander adopting Eastern ways is an affront to who they were.
Yeah.
And so these are some things that cause friction between him and his troops. And there's also further episodes of his dark side when his best friend, Hephaestion, dies. He goes mad for days, doesn't shave his beard or cut his hair. One of the things that shows his dark side is he orders the doctor, Hephaestion's doctor, to be killed because he thought the doctor didn't do enough to save him and such. And then Harris also talks about him pointing fingers, like at his wife Roxana. Maybe she wanted Hephaestion out of the way, but that's something we won't know for sure. But you see here. So later on, after he conquers the Persian Empire, not everybody's satisfied with his rule. Some people regard him as a tyrannical figure. And that does remind me, there was another episode. It was the Conspiracy of the Pages, where Hermolaus, a Macedonian page, killed a wild boar before Alexander did, and he was chastised for it. And then he and some others tried to conspire against Alexander. They were plotting to kill him in his sleep. Now, of course, he did put down this conspiracy, but the thing here is it shows not everybody is happy with what he did. And furthermore, this also does remind me about some other things, is like, what was Alexander's real intention behind
Exactly.
conquering the Persian Empire? They've asked this about Philip too. Some people believe that Philip was only going to conquer probably Persia and then maybe stop, but Alexander went further. And then Alexander, when he does go further east, one episode that historians do think portrays his dark side was the burning of the temple at Persepolis. Now, remember, Alexander didn't do that himself. Someone who was celebrating with him there got drunk and then threw a torch into the palace. But then when they were warned that the palace was burning, Alexander just said, "Let it burn," because some people think this was his means of avenging Greece during the Greco-Persian Wars. Because when they looted Persepolis, they found some Greek artifacts from Athens that Xerxes looted when they sacked Athens after Thermopylae. And then Alexander ordered those returned. But the fact that he let the temple burn, some people regard that as a crime as well. And yeah, so these are some of the major things that people do say are episodes that portray Alexander's dark side. There are a number of historians out there who have written about this over the years. They try whatever they can to interpret Alexander as a tyrant, as a conqueror. Yeah, if I may, I could just cite certain historians.
Sure, definitely. Go ahead.
Yeah, like Brian Bosworth is probably one of the most renowned Alexander scholars. He's also known as A.B. Bosworth. One of his best works was Conquest and Empire: The Reign of Alexander. That I have that book. It's a pretty good book. But the thing is, he remains consistent throughout a number of his works, saying that Alexander's an accursed tyrant and a conqueror. Like, one of the things he argues is that Alexander killing is what he did best, and that he says that when Alexander went east, his actions in the east were considered vile. They were considered cruel, and he attacks older scholars like W.W. Tarn and others, saying that he's being too lenient on Alexander, or that he's relying on certain primary sources like Plutarch more and such. And then he also says that the Macedonians destroying the citadel of Mali where Alexander got injured by an arrow wound, like destroying the citadel was an act of aggression, like a big act of violence. But the thing about that is, remember, Alexander was injured during that, and his men destroyed the citadel. And furthermore, Bosworth also goes as far as saying that Alexander deprived Macedonia of its male childbearing population by taking them on campaign. And he's saying that Alexander brought a lot of these men to their deaths. These are men that could have lived out peaceful lives. Historians like Bosworth go so far as condemning Alexander like that. And also there was a historian named John Previs who wrote a book called Envy of the Gods, Alexander the Great's Ill-Fated Journey Across Asia. He goes far as saying that when Alexander campaigned, a lot of innocent people were killed, like when he went east. And furthermore, he's saying the same thing Bosworth did. A lot of ill-fated Macedonian officers died for no reason. There is he and some other scholars have said this. if you may recall, after Alexander's coming back from India, half of his men go by sea with Nearchus, the Cretan admiral, and the other half go across the desert with him. And a lot of men perish under the scorching sun. Some historians, including Previs and Bosworth and them, say that Alexander, when marching across the desert, that they said so many of his men died under the scorching sun, and that Alexander probably did this to punish them because they didn't want to go further east to India. It's something we won't know 100% for sure, but there are a lot of historians who've blamed him for that. They're saying this is why he had his men go across a desert, and a lot of them perished under the sun.
That is all that you said to me, Professor Matthews, is just, so interesting because we know, like, when all the movies and all the documentaries we've had of Alexander the Great, we know nothing of the other side of his personality. And you're absolutely right when talking about, what was Alexander's end goal. Because if his end goal was to conquer the Persian Empire, he succeeded. He had the Persian Empire. That empire, combined with his Macedonian, was the largest empire at that time, but he kept going further and further, conquering other small kingdoms. So it does bring up the question, what was his end goal? Because I've also done research on this topic as well, with a lot of other scholars saying, Alexander was a fantastic general. You could make arguments all you want about like his character as a king, but as a general and as a skilled military leader, he was second to none at his time. However, ruling was something at least we don't see a lot of, because how would he have governed his empire? Because the line of communication in the ancient world was so vast and expansive.
There are scholars who do say that Alexander may have been a great general, but the empire that he ultimately forged, if he had lived and maintained that empire, would he have made a good king? Historians have questioned that because remember, his empire quickly dissolved after his death.
Yes.
So it's something we may never know about, would he have been able to maintain all that? And the other thing is there are historians who do question who was truly greater, him or his father Philip.
Oh, yes, that is very, very true, And for people who do not know or have not researched like Philip II of Macedonia, he was probably at his time like a very powerful military leader. He had dreams. Actually, the dreams that Alexander had were based on his father. His father wanted to be the one to conquer and create the Macedonian empire. And if you look at Alexander, he succeeded his father's expectations and even created his own name. Some could argue, he wanted to be better than his father. He wanted to be better than any other general that had existed before him. And also, we talk about, being a good king. There's also one aspect of being a good king which Alexander did not do, which is establishing a monarchy line, because that was another issue after his death. There is evidence that he may have had children with concubines, multiple women, but who was the true heir of the Macedonian throne? We don't know. And that's where you had the Battle of Antioch, where you had the different generals fighting over dominion of his empire, which resulted in the carving up of the Hellenistic world. You had one general who took Antioch, one general who created the Ptolemaic dynasty. You had the other general who created the it starts with an S, but I'm forgetting what the name is.
Are you talking about Seleucus from the Seleucid?
Yes, the Seleucids. Yes, that was another general who founded his own kingdom, and all of these wanted to create their own dynasty. Heck, even the Romans, when they met them, these were kingdoms that were descendants from Alexander the Great. So it's really interesting that Alexander's legacy outlived him. What was Greek still existed, but again, there are so many different avenues to explore about his character, and some could argue, which I actually posed to you, Professor Matthews, these violent outbursts, do you think from your research and from other research, this may have stemmed possibly from his childhood growing up? Because I don't think we really explored that aspect of Alexander's upbringing, like growing up in this world where, there are multiple contenders to the throne. And as you said earlier, as soon as Alexander took the throne of Macedonia, he went about killing all his political rivals because he didn't want anyone to even have a whiff or a chance to rebel against him.
Going back, I just want to say one thing though, but going back to what you were saying, there were potential heirs to the throne. You're forgetting about his son Alexander the Fourth, who
Yes,
wasn't
I
born yet,
forgot about
and they
him.
also mentioned Philip the Third of Macedon. Like they were
Yes,
both
forgot
they
about
were
those
both
two.
seen as the potential heirs, but the generals wanted power for themselves because Alexander the Fourth wasn't born yet. He was just a young boy, and then Philip the Third, remember, uh, suffered from mental illness, and
Mm,
they didn't see them as the right heirs. And also remember, Cassander of Macedon seized power
yes,
for himself, and he tried to eliminate Alexander's whole bloodline. He had Olympius killed later, and then he was one person behind really condemning Alexander. And when Cassander came to power, he also restored Thebes and rebuilt the city.
yes, that's correct. That is absolutely correct. Thank you for that, Professor Matthews.
Now, yeah, no, your other question about that is about Alexander's in his boyhood. Yeah, the thing is, there is very little to say about his boyhood because remember, Plutarch is our main primary source on that,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of him as a boyhood is sorry, him as a prince of Macedon. A lot of that is portrayed in a positive light.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, like, they're just talking about how Leonidas of Epirus trained him to be a warrior. And then he gets an intellectual education from Aristotle. And they say that when Persian ambassadors came to the Macedonian royal court, he asked them a lot of questions. And he was very inquisitive. And they were impressed by how much the young boy knew and that's such. And I mean, the first time we see any act of aggression on his part was Philip was going to lay siege to Byzantium, and he made Alexander regent. And then Alexander, as regent, put down a revolting Thracian tribe and told them to rename their city Alexandropolis. And
Ooh.
that's a very ambitious thing from a young age. And then the next thing we see is Philip makes him a general at Chaeronea, and he was only 18 years old. And then after that, we do see the rift between him and Philip because of Philip taking another wife and probably going to have another another heir. And then there was that quarrel that he had with Attalus at the wedding festival. And then, yeah, these are some of the early signs of Alexander's aggression and such. But yeah, it's hard to tie that though to his later dark side when he's that we see when he's king. You know,
Right. Definitely. And, some could argue that this was probably like, he had deep heat by winning so many battles and, establishing his legacy. Some could argue, and I've read, a lot of fiction books from a lot of historical fiction authors who have built on this idea that, he possibly viewed himself as unstoppable, that he was unbeatable. No one could best him in combat. He was the best strategist, the best general. He had the loyalty of his men who would follow him to the ends of the earth. That was what he was imagining. But the history side, the truth behind that is a little bit more murky and complex because, as you said, Professor Matthews, his men were getting tired. They were getting exhausted. I mean, they were campaigning like days on end, years on end. There was never a moment where they weren't campaigning. Yes, in the sources, there's evidence that they took reprieve at some of the numerous cities that he conquered, but eventually they were right back on their feet campaigning and fighting. I would imagine, as a typical Macedonian Greek soldiers, like, I have a wife and kid who's probably waiting for me. I've been constantly fighting. I probably haven't even been paid, not that much. And it's like, why are we still fighting? We already are the supreme power in the region. So it is very, fascinating to explore. But I definitely think, as you brought up, the other historians who have discussed, condemning Alexander the Great, I also think that brings into like a big issue of exerting our interpretations of, what a tyrant is, villainy, cruel rulers from a more pre-modern context, and not really understanding the historical context that Alexander was living. Yes, he did have violent moments, but was he truly an evil king? Are there any scholars that do say that? Yes, there's probably evidence of, like, scholars of the time, maybe a few hundred years after, who wrote to probably discredit him, to probably, destroy his influence. But ultimately, as a collective, was he truly a wicked, vile king? We honestly don't know. And we can't really put that notion on him, because that's not really fair to the figure Alexander the Great or the history that has been written about him.
Right. And as I said before at the beginning, I personally take the middle ground, as do a number of the older historians like W. Tarn, Nicholas
Mm,
Hammond. They juxtapose his good and bad qualities. And yes, Nicholas Hammond, I recommend his work because he died in 2001, but
mm.
he was considered the foremost expert on ancient Macedon of his time. His works were probably the most accurate. I recommend his biographies, his works more than Robin Lane Fox and Peter Green or any others, because his works are probably the most accurate. And he takes the middle ground himself. He says that on one hand, you do have a genius, a great general, but at the same time, he had a dreadful legacy that was to further savagery in the name of glory, and to leave a model of command that far too many men of ambition sought to act out in the centuries to come. Excuse me. Um, there are two other scholars, though, I do want to note who do juxtapose the good and bad qualities. There's a guy named Guy McLean Rogers who wrote Alexander the Great and the Ambiguity of Greatness. He says Alexander was responsible for the deaths and enslavement of thousands of people in his campaigns, but he never made it a policy to do so, because somebody like that is on par with Genghis Khan. And he said Alexander he was definitely not on par with Jesus. And he definitely didn't follow the commandment, thou shalt not kill. But he may have, but he's not quite on par with people who have really been condemned by history, like Hernan Cortez, Adolf Hitler, Joseph
Yes.
Stalin. He's saying Alexander's definitely not up there with them, because according to his biography, he wrote that Alexander told his men not to pillage, but spare the properties that they came across. And he does acknowledge Alexander, and admires him as a great military genius, a strategist, and also a master of logistics.
Hmm.
Yeah, if you read the Donald Engels book, The Logistics of the Macedonian Army, that was an unprecedented study about the logistics done that were performed in the throughout the whole campaign. And they
All
saying that
right.
Alexander did a great job with that. And one other scholar I do want to mention was one of the more recent biographies. Well, this one came out in 2012, so it's more recent than a lot of the other works on Alexander, was Philip Freeman's biography. He made a biography where he does say Alexander is a violent man. He's no better than Hannibal or Caesar, that he spread terror in his campaign and killed thousands of civilian lives. And today, he could have been deemed a war criminal. And the thing is, he also, to quote him, he says, whether we approve of Alexander's often brutal tactics, every reasonable student of history must agree he was one of the great military minds of all time. And Philip Freeman further calls him Prometheus, giving knowledge to mankind by giving fire, which Prometheus did. They're saying Alexander gave knowledge and of Greek culture, Greek Hellenic thought. He spread Greek culture throughout all the different civilizations throughout Asia. And he's at the very height of human ambition. And so he thought Alexander's good and bad qualities deserve equal treatment.
That's
So
absolutely true.
so these are the historians I do agree with. I do agree that we can't really acknowledge one side without acknowledging the other. And as I said at the beginning of this video, this tells you Alexander's personality is a very complex one. Yeah,
Definitely.
there's so many sides to it. You can't really say one or the other, but some people do take one side or the other.
That's very, very true. And you can even apply that same argument to other classical figures, like, of course, Julius Caesar and Hannibal of Carthage. Well, actually, especially Julius Caesar, especially, how he very much modeled himself after Alexander the Great. I mean, he served with his legions, he gained the trust of his legions. The legions would follow him to the ends of the earth. And when he was murdered by the Senate and their conspirators, the legions mourned him. They loved him. He was their father in a way. And a lot of sources show that, especially when, especially in media, when you look at Rome, the TV show, and HBO, when Augustus in that representation takes command, he says, who would, mourn the loss of Caesar, who would tell the legions who loved him that these guys are still alive. And by these guys, viewers and listeners, I mean the two conspirators who killed Caesar, Brutus and
Yes.
Yes. And Augustus pretty much said, we are going to vote to have these men killed. If you don't, my legion is here to make sure you do vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually in that scene. It was a reference to like it was in a way portraying how he later became emperor. Because later a centurion came into the Senate chamber and said, and showed his sword to the Senate and said, "Elect him or this will." Because it was taboo for Roman legionnaires and especially centurions to go into the Senate chamber like that. To go along with what you were saying earlier, you also know the story about Caesar when he was 32 and he was made quaestor in Spain. He supposedly came across a statue of Alexander and that he wept at the foot of the statue. Yeah, for all we know, him suffering from Alexander envy like that, although there may be some truth to that, that story could have been made to discredit Caesar because Alexander was 32, a month short of being 33 when he died. And they're saying that Caesar thought his accomplishments at 32 were nothing compared to Alexander's. And yet Caesar gained glory later on in his life. And to this day, he's the most memorable of all Romans.
Yeah, he is.
And also what you're saying about Hannibal is, excuse me, whether this story is true or not has been questionable. But the story about when Hannibal confronts Scipio Africanus years later after the Battle of Zama. Then Scipio asked him about who do you think are the greatest generals of history? And then he puts Alexander as number one, and then he puts Pyrrhus of Epirus as number two, and then Hannibal says number three is myself. Remember that? So in that story, he puts Alexander as number one.
Absolutely, which again shows like the legacy of Alexander, of this figure. I mean, he was probably like the ancient world's first celebrity, which everyone wanted to be like Alexander, because you could argue there was no one like Alexander at that time at such a young age to command troops, to create a vast army, a well-disciplined army with tactics that were foreign to the Greeks as well as their enemies. It's ultimately, a testament to who he is. But we also have to acknowledge he's a very complex individual. A lot of the people of the classical age were very, very complex. They had good sides and they also had bad sides. So we have to do, as scholars do, we have to examine both sides to really get a good picture. And we can't really look at one side being greater than the other, because that does a disservice to people like Alexander the Great. And almost like as a final question, Professor Matthews, with this discussion of viewing classical characters, do you believe that, how would I word this, that this same mindset's also important to look at, let's say, medieval figures, let's say the Crusading Knights? I was actually in an interview with an author, uh, Steve Tibble, who wrote about the Crusaders who went rogue in the Holy Lands, because we have this mindset that the Crusaders were deemed as on the right side of history. But you look at their other truth, some of these knights committed heinous crimes, but most people don't really want to explore that because it would damage their scholarship, or damage the scholarship of the Crusaders and the Crusades. What are your thoughts on that, as well as other topics in history that have only been given one side?
Yeah, the thing what you're mentioning about the Crusades, yes, a lot of the Knight Templars were accused of such heinous crimes and such. And but I've read books where they do acknowledge, like, the good things about the Knight Templars, and also what they were accused of heresy, and then disrespecting the cross, etc. All that. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the Crusades is definitely a topic where we have um, perspectives from both the Muslim and the Christian scholars. So what you're talking about here is, it sounds like that what you mentioned is just acknowledging the Christian side. The Muslim scholars and their perspective is not acknowledged here. So I do
Mm-hmm.
feel like their perspective is uh, something that we should acknowledge to get the full picture, because that's the thing with the Crusades in general. Is on one side, like when you take the first Crusade, for example, um, Christian scholars, those will say it was a noble endeavor, but on the other hand, Muslims will say it was nothing but a massacre, that it was just ruthless killing for no reason. And I've had students who've taken those sides as well. But and most of them, they take the Muslim side and say that there was nothing noble or righteous about the Crusades. So the thing is, this is a topic where we have primary sources that go in both directions. And so because of that, we have a well-rounded perspective, and things can be argued from both ways. So as a result, there's no consensus.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Professor Matthews. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another great discussion here on the channel for season 3 of the Historians Lounge. I want to give a huge thank you to Professor Matthews for coming back on the show and discussing with us Alexander the Great and who he was, and the research that's been done about him. Professor Matthews, thank you so very much. And just as a quick reminder, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out? And do you have any upcoming projects that you are a part of that we can expect later this year?
Yeah, my a lot of my social media, a lot of that can be found online with like P Matthew 42. That's my Instagram name. And yeah, and then just type in my name on Facebook and LinkedIn, wherever, and you'll find me there. And the and any upcoming projects, well, I just published a book review about about a book that came out for the University of Michigan Press. It was called Domitian's Rome and the Augustan Legacy. It's a very good book about how we see the legacy of Caesar Augustus in the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. I am trying to work on another book review about a book about soldier and society in Roman Egypt. It's like a social
Ooh,
history. Yeah, the book is not bad. And aside from that, I'm still working on the book about Julius Caesar, and I am also working on, some upcoming articles, that on Roman history.
awesome. I'll link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for season 3, episode 1 of the Historians Lounge. Again, a huge thank you to my guest, Professor Mathew, for making a return on the show. We wish him the very best for this year in 2025. And thank you again, listeners, for joining us again. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And as always, I will see you in the next video. Until then, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And one final thing, if you want to check out Professor Mathew's first interview on the show, I will link it right here for you to watch. Until then, have a wonderful day.